Hey everyone, I'm Mike Henry, and this is my Procreate 4.1 demo for the piece I call Krieger. So it's pretty clear if you watch Archer who this is. Dr. Algernon Krieger, easily one of the standout characters. So my wife and I have been doing a big rewatch of Archer, so I thought it'd be fun to do Krieger because he's just visually distinct and you can kind of play with him a little bit more, and I think that he still sort of like holds up even if you distort him a little bit more than others would. So I knew right away that I wanted this thing to be rendered, so you'll see that the super rough, which is what's going on right now, just goes to a slightly tighter version of itself, which is what this is right here, and then it goes into paints. I try not to overwork the lines when I know I'm going to render something. I've mentioned this in the past, but it saves time for one, and it also allows me to tweak it when I get to the painting process, and I'm not all hung up on whether or not it's sort of accurate to the blueprint. So, didn't do any type of extreme pushing or pulling. The art style in Archer is quite conservative from a distortion point of view, so I thought that just doing like a little bit here or there was enough to sort of bring it over into my world, so to speak, instead of it being already stylized and then I feel I have to push it a crazy amount. You can see right there with the way that flat went down that the neck is part of a layer stack, and now here's the face, and the face is going to be part of a layer stack, the face skin. Then the hair layer will go on top of all of that, and the beard and the hair are all part of just one continuous layer. He doesn't have really any definition between his beard hair color and his hair color, so it just makes sense to make it all the same. It's kind of interesting too, the perception of color, because for instance, my brain sort of acknowledges that Krieger is a redhead, but he actually isn't. I mean, he might be in terms of the way that color is perceived, but when you actually look at like the key art from the show, he's just got straight brown hair. But there's something about that perception that makes me think redhead. So when I started this, he's got this orangey color for his flat, because I was like, well, of course, because he's redheaded, so I'm going to start with that. And upon further inspection, I was like, well, I guess he's not. It sort of goes to that same concept of when you are asked what color a street is, and your initial reaction might be that it's black because it's pavement, but in reality most streets are like a light gray or a tan because they've been worn down over the years, and that's sort of that weird color perception thing that can happen. So now we are just finishing the hair flat. You can see that his beard is actually a little extra spiky, and I sort of get that under control a little bit later when I get to the beard, because I realize that, I mean, he's fairly clean cut, and even though I was adding in some of these more exaggerated features, that was one that I just wanted to get under control and get closer to the way he actually appears. In another weird way too, like Archer is pretty washed out overall. Its color palette is on the really light desaturated side most of the time, and so when I started doing the skin tone, he's actually like super saturated and much darker than he is in the show, and you'll see me start to struggle with that because I'm just sort of painting and just mindlessly doing just a generic Caucasian skin, and then when I get to it being like close to finish, you might see it here, it'll start to flash brighter because I start to realize like, oh shit, he should actually be way paler than this, and so that's something that's coming up, and I'll point that out when it happens. As for brushes, the brush rundown, so the rough sketch was all done with the fat pencil, and the painting of his not just his face, I think just about the whole thing was done with that hard circle brush with the soft airbrush as my eraser to start pulling that back. For instance, if you go back a second and see the way I did that ear, you can see it gets thrown in with really hard edges and then knocked back with that softer brush. So you saw there for a minute, I switched to the neck, did the neck layers. Now on to the next value for the skin, just doing a usual workup where the shadows are going a little bit more red to purple, and the highlights are going to be going more to a orange yellow. For lighting, I didn't want to do anything super unique in this one. I've been doing like a lot of experimental lighting setups, and I just wanted to avoid that and sort of relax and just have like fun painting something. Also, the lighting in Archer is fairly generic, and so I thought that it'd be kind of cool to just keep it straight on, but I give it a little bit of this noir vibe with some of the lighting around him, but he doesn't really have any type of crazy lighting scheme going on. He's just got sort of like a more or less straight down, slightly in front of him light with a rim light on the side, and then I put like a darkening halo around his entire shape, I guess you could say, to darken the edges, and then when you get like the cast shadow and the lighting, it gives it a noir vibe. So you can see right there all his skin just brightened up a bit. And now I think I'm on the darkest layer for the skin. So now we're just framing his eyes a little bit, getting some of that extra dark in some of the parts of the ear, like the ear hole, and then some of those other little areas, and then the cast shadow coming down from his ear and his jawline. Putting a little bit of purple, set to multiply, around the eyelids to put some darkening in there, and then did some pink, not set to anything, but just lowered dramatically in opacity for his nose and ear flush. So now we've moved into the eyes, rendered out the the sclera part of the eye, and then the little meat part, the little eye meat, and then now he's got actually pretty strong eyelashes, so I thought it'd be fun to go in and just make that still really strong even in this version of him. So now working, just added the pupil and working on the iris. Nothing real special going on here. This is all just standard techniques, all done with that hard circle brush that I mentioned earlier. Get a shine in his eye that kind of looks like the tile lighting of an office. Adding a little bit of the water sort of that collects at the base of the eye. And then there you can see that was sort of like the last brightness check on his skin, and that feels like really dramatic, or I shouldn't say dramatic, it feels like it's like almost like too bright now, but if you go back and look at the way it did, he suddenly looks like crazy tan. So it definitely needed to happen to get him to his like full Kriegerness. So now working on the hair, it's going a little bit in the orange direction. You can see with the way it's getting laid down there. I believe it gets tamped back a little bit and the saturation gets pulled down because, again, constantly checking it against the ref. When I was painting this, I had a side window open that had a really good key shot of him from the show, so I just kept making sure I was referring back to it. His beard has a bit of a stylized thing going on where I have these like layers of spiky hair going down. And then the shine that I end up throwing on it is also really stylized. You can see me, of course, extending past the flat. Those of you who've watched a lot of videos know that what I'll eventually do is take that under flat, select the inverse of it, and delete away some of that paint. So not really much to comment on here. I mean, right there, actually something to comment on was the desaturation. That's the making it all more brown and less red. But otherwise, this is all just sort of in and noodling it. Nothing that really stands out as a unique technique going on here. there's that stylized shine I was talking about. And that was just done using the selection tool and throwing it in real quick, and then going back and erasing it to soften it and make it feel more like the light's hitting it in the right way. Some of that was done actually to mimic the way it looks in the show. Not 100%, but to be in the same spirit of it. And now we're to the darkest layer, where I'm just adding in some extra definition. You can see it on the back there and sort of by his ear where it's crossing over. That's just to make sure that some of those forms are getting punched up the right way. So finishing off with the eyebrows and the hair are all part of the same flat system. So now we'll select it and delete it, and select the inverse of it, and delete it. And now we move into the shirt. The shirt and his lab coat are actually pretty straightforward. This whole thing is actually really straightforward, since that was kind of the point of it. It's like straightforward painting techniques, straightforward design or redesign, I guess. Even literally a straightforward light on him, and that was just sort of the premise. So here I'm going in and putting in a little bit of darkening to add some definition on the edges. I actually did this using the select paint, select clear method, which is linked below. I think it's kind of interesting to point that out to show that that has application outside of the usual, where you're just putting a shadow layer on flats. I'm now using that same method to put some of that extra definition, that darkening around the edges of his face and beard and neck and stuff. Okay, so now the tie is completely painted in. We're going through and doing the lab coat. You can see it's like really misty there because I used a big fat soft brush and sort of filled in a lot of that area, and it went beyond the edges. Then I went back in, of course, and selected the inverse and deleted away. I sort of put down the parts of this lab coat really fast, and now this is the phase where I'm going through and tightening it up a little bit because it was a little too loose at first. Adding some textures across the whole thing. You can see the tie texture, the shirt texture. There's even like a light skin texture on him, which is actually a technique that I used to use all the time, but I sort of stopped doing it. The skin technique, where it's just a very, very, very light texture. And in the past I would use like a galvanized metal texture, but on this one I used one of the grunge brushes from Procreate. It works out pretty well. So now it's time for the rim light. Just a simple application of the rim light. It's white, nothing more than that. Just applied really softly so that it has a bit of a soft glow coming off the background. That color that I've got already back there, that's not really the color that I knew I was going to end up with, but I wanted to have something that approximated just like a drab office. I was sort of imagining them maybe being in like the lunch room, the break room, I guess, or something. But then at the end I decided to do a much more elaborate background. Oh, I shouldn't say that. That was way overselling it. It's not a much more elaborate background. It's just a background and not a flat wall. So I do a really brief like framing so that it looks like there's like some wood paneling or something going on behind him. So after doing that generalized rim light, now I'm going in and making sure it's all modeled a little bit more closely to what's actually there. Like actual strands of hair and the ridges in his forehead and all that kind of stuff. And his eyebrow. Throwing a little bit there on the lab coat and on the tie, and then adjusting its opacities so that it looks good and not too strong. Adding a little bit of bounce from his neck, and here's the more dramatic lighting. And now this next part goes by real quick because it's just a series of fills and shapes, but you can see here just using some simple rectangles and colors, some drop shadows, and faking some wood grain, adding a little bit of wall texture, and then taking and dirtying it up a bit, and then taking that whole thing and just warping it, and now it makes it look like it's some paneling that's behind him. Then I duplicate him, set it to black, blur it, distort it, and now you've got that big ass drop shadow going down there onto the wall behind him. Adding some extra bounce now that's coming from that wall behind him. And I did a bunch of post-processing stuff there, but then I decided to go in and tweak some more stuff. So you can see here along his hairline, I'm adding all these little notches in. This is something that maybe on the video it doesn't really show up that well, but when you see this piece at full size on an iPad Pro, it's really clear. And depending on what size these could ever be, it's that little detail that's really worth it because it adds a lot. It's funny because it's like almost indecipherable, all of the little things that are going on right now, but every now and then you can see going across, like down by his chin where the hair comes up by his lip, you can see some little notches getting added in there just to make that hairline a little bit more natural looking. It's just a lot of little small things like that. Okay, and now we pull out for the final touches where I do a bunch of like little last minute tweaks to it. And usually I just sort of gloss over those, so let's actually go in deeper and talk about them. So here we've got a simplified version of the Procreate file. We've got the background on a layer, we've got his head and that drop shadow on a layer, we've got his shirt and jacket on a layer, and then we've got sort of a lot of the layers that make up some of his extra dimension. So we're going to turn those on, and the ones that I really want to talk about here are, of course, here to turn on the eye shine and the eye glint. And then here's his rim light. It's actually made up of two layers, a really saturated orangey one, and then on top of that's white, and then they've had their opacities adjusted, and that's to try and give some richness to the white rim light, and where the transparency starts to kick in, some of the richer color starts to bleed in. So here is a little secret layer that's sort of an extra touch. It's these little stray hairs. It actually adds a lot when you notice them, and it's really easy to do. Just throw it on an extra layer there. And now here's the bounce light coming from that back wall. These are all some of the last touches that got added in towards the end of the piece. And then the little ear shadow, just to add some extra depth to that ear right there. Now for the post-processing stuff specifically, here's something that you'll see me use, and I don't know if I've explained it in the past. So if we go over to now it's in the add section. This part of the Procreate demo was done in the new version of Procreate. So you click copy canvas and then create a new layer and paste the canvas. And now you can see as I toggle it on and off, there's no difference between those two. And then go to a Gaussian blur and blur it to what feels like the right amount. So right there you see it's pretty blurry. But now if we go in with a soft airbrush eraser, we can erase away from that new layer that we've created and bring a lot of attention to areas, because that's where the sharper parts are. It's like simulating not a rack focus, I can't think of the word, but like a vignette focus. It's like faux depth of field, I guess you could say. And but it's really nice for just sort of bringing attention to certain areas. Now as an extra touch, let's create a white layer on top of everything, and then go into the adjustments and add noise. So just crank up that noise, and you can see it there, but it's really fine. Even when I zoom in all the way, you can see how fine that noise is. And so I'll take that layer and size it up way past the canvas so that it's effectively increasing the size of the individual pixels of the noise. And then set it to multiply, which you can see how overly strong it is right there, but it's taken all of that white and it's disappeared it. And then I lower the opacity of that layer, and you can see that it adds like a nice little subtle texture to everything. As a last little tweak, let's copy the canvas one more time and paste it in. Maybe there's something about your piece that you'd like to adjust some of its color using color balance. So here you can see maybe we go into the shadows and we adjust the cyan, and we go into the highlights and we maybe make it more red or more green. You can see all the little tweaks that are happening to it. If I toggle it with the preview, you can see just how different the two are. So let's reset it and make the shadows maybe more purple, the midtones a little bit more yellow and red, and then the highlights more yellow, and you get something that looks like that. You can see the difference. Maybe that's something that you want to do to it. Let's assume for a second you do, but maybe it's too strong. If you already just go back, instead of worrying about it in the color balance section, you can adjust the opacity of that layer and try to get some sort of an equilibrium between the original and what you've adjusted it to. And maybe that then turns out to be exactly what you're looking for. Now this here is exactly what I was looking for. This is the final look of the piece. This is where I decided to leave it, and I think it does a pretty good representation of Krieger while also bringing it into a little bit of how I usually do things. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider all the liking, subscribing crap, and I'll see you on the next one. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.